Dear listeners, I welcome you to my channel. If you like my work, please subscribe to the channel, like this video and write a comment. This helps the video to promote and motivates you to try harder every day. If you want to support the channel financially, the link is in the description and in the profile header. Thank you. Enjoy listening. I was 17 when my father vanished without a trace. One evening, he left the house for a business meeting, kissed my mother goodbye, ruffled my hair as he passed me in the hallway, and promised he wouldn't be late. He never came home. At first, we assumed he had just gotten caught up in work. Maybe his phone had died. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe 1,000 other harmless possibilities had played out, delaying him from returning home. But as the hours stretched into days, and the days into weeks, it became terrifyingly clear that something was very wrong. The police were useless. They searched his usual routes, checked his office, questioned his colleagues. They found his car abandoned in a parking lot downtown, but there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as if he had stepped out of his vehicle and disappeared into thin air. We plastered missing person posters around the city, pleaded with news stations to keep his face in the public eye. My mother, once a vibrant and strong woman, withered into a shell of herself. She spent sleepless nights at the kitchen table, eyes hollow and red-rimmed, staring at the front door as if willing him to walk through it. I felt helpless. I was too young to do anything meaningful, too naive to understand the depths of loss. All I have were memories, his laugh, his firm handshake, the way he always smelled faintly of coffee and leather. They became relics of a past that no longer felt real. Months passed. Then years. The police eventually closed the case due to a lack of leads. My mother stopped speaking about him altogether, burying her grief beneath layers of forced normalcy. And me? I never stopped wondering. Never stopped searching, even when it seemed hopeless. By the time I turned 22, the world had moved on. But I hadn't. I spent sleepless nights combing through online archives, crime databases, conspiracy forums. I read every theory, every speculation, every wild claim. Some believed he had run away, living under a new identity. Others insisted he had been kidnapped by a cult or a secret government agency. None of it made sense. None of it felt right. And then, 5 years after his disappearance, I found something that changed everything. It started with a simple notification, an old email address, one that had been dormant since before he vanished, had been accessed. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the alert on my screen. The login had come from an untraceable IP, somewhere buried deep in the shadows of the internet. It was impossible. My father was either gone or someone else was using his credentials. I hesitated before opening the inbox, half expecting it to be empty. But there was a single unread message. No subject. No sender information. Just a string of numbers and an ominous URL. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The link led me to a forum I had never seen before. The interface was old, clunky, reminiscent of early 2000s message boards. The background was pitch black, the text a ghostly green. Threads with cryptic titles filled the homepage, conversations about secret societies, human experiments, and things much darker than I was prepared to read. But one thread stood out among the rest. It was titled, "He's Still Alive." And beneath it, the first post contained only a single image, a blurry, grainy photo of a man, bound and blindfolded, sitting in a dimly lit room. A man who looked exactly like my father. My heart stopped. My mind screamed at me to close the page, to pretend I had never seen it. But I couldn't look away. My hands trembled as I scrolled down, reading the replies beneath the image. Someone had commented, "Auction starts soon." Another, "Not a bad price for someone who used to be important." My blood turned to ice. My father wasn't just missing. He had been taken. And someone was selling him on the dark web. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. The image of my father burned into my mind. The dim lighting, the rope sticking into his wrists, the expression of silent despair, it was all too real. Too horrifying. But worst of all, the implications were undeniable. He was alive, and someone was planning to sell him. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to focus. The forum was unlike anything I had seen before, primitive, yet functional, lurking in the darkest corners of the internet where law and morality held no power. I had heard stories about places like this, where criminals traded in secrets, contraband, and human lives. But seeing it firsthand, knowing that my father was a victim of this nightmare, made my blood run cold. The thread had over a dozen replies, each more disturbing than the last. Users with cryptic usernames discussed logistics, potential buyers, and the legitimacy of the auction. Some doubted whether the man in the photo was worth anything. Others claimed to know his history. One comment stood out to me: if he's really who they say he is, this changes everything. Who they say he is? What did they mean? My father was just a businessman, ordinary, kind, and devoted to his family. Or at least, that's what I had always believed. But this message suggested there was more to his disappearance than a random abduction. I had to dig deeper. With a few clicks, I traced the conversation to an encrypted chat room. Access was restricted, requiring an invitation code. I clenched my jaw. Whoever these people were, they had no intention of letting outsiders in easily. But if there was one thing I had learned over the years of obsessively searching for my father, it was how to break into places I wasn't supposed to be. I spent the next 2 hours sifting through source code, bypassing firewalls, and testing backdoors. Sweat dripped from my forehead as I finally cracked the encryption and gained access to the chat. My heart pounded as the conversation unfolded in real time. Lot number 47 is confirmed for tomorrow night. Location? Same as usual. Guests will receive coordinates an hour before. Starting price? 6 figures. I clenched my fists. Lot number 47, was that my father? It had to be. My mind raced as I tried to process what to do next. I needed those coordinates. I needed to know where they were holding him. But I couldn't exactly ask without raising suspicion. Instead, I decided to blend in. Using a fabricated identity, I posted a simple message. Interested? Any proof of life? Minutes crawled by in agonizing silence before someone responded. A new image loaded on my screen, another photo of my father, this time with today's date scrawled on a piece of paper beside him. He was alive, but for how much longer? My chest tightened. I was running out of time. Then, another message appeared, DM for details. My pulse quickened. This was my way in. Taking a deep breath, I opened the private chat, preparing myself for whatever lay ahead. I didn't know who I was dealing with, but I did know one thing. I would do whatever it took to get my father back. The private chat window blinked on my screen, a single unread message waiting for me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea who I was about to engage with, only that they had information about my father, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get it. I clicked the message. You want in? Prove you're serious. Beneath it was a set of instructions, cryptic but precise. They wanted me to complete a small task, a test to prove I wasn't law enforcement or an outsider looking to stir up trouble. The request was simple on the surface: transfer a small amount of cryptocurrency to an anonymous wallet and decrypt a locked file they sent. But I knew the real test wasn't the transaction itself, it was to see how far I was willing to go. I hesitated for only a moment before I pulled up my digital wallet. I had spent years lurking in forums like these, researching, learning. I had a stash of crypto set aside for moments like this. Moments I had always hoped I'd never have to face. I transferred the required amount. Seconds later, another message appeared. Good. Download the file. You have 30 minutes. I clicked the link and watched as a small encrypted document appeared on my desktop. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I ran decryption software, peeling away layers of encoded security. Whoever had locked this file knew what they were doing. It took me 20 minutes, but I finally cracked it open. Inside was a single address. My stomach tightened. I copied the address into a search tool, but it didn't appear on any public databases. No records. No history. Just a set of coordinates on a map, deep within an industrial district on the outskirts of the city. Another message popped up. Tomorrow. Midnight. Come alone. I swallowed hard. This was it. My only lead. My only chance. The next night, I drove through the desolate streets, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The warehouse district was eerily quiet, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I parked my car a block away, tucked a small knife into my jacket, and pulled my hood up. If this was a trap, I had to be ready. I approached the warehouse, heart hammering. A single red light flickered above a rusted door. I knocked twice, as instructed. The door creaked open, revealing a man in a black mask. He stared at me for a moment before stepping aside. Inside, he said. I took a deep breath and entered. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rust. The room was dimly lit, lined with old wooden crates. A single laptop sat on a table in the center. The masked man motioned for me to sit. Before we continue, he said, his voice low and unreadable, I need to know. How much are you willing to risk for him? I met his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. Everything. The man nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The screen flickered, and then I saw him, my father, bound to a chair, his face gaunt, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Resignation. Or maybe acceptance. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Son, you shouldn't have come looking for me. The moment I heard my father's voice, my entire body tensed. He looked frail, almost unrecognizable, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper than fear. It was a warning. The masked man stood beside me, watching my reaction closely. I forced myself to stay calm, but inside, a storm was raging. Where is he? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic device. He placed it on the table, and a red light flickered to life. We don't have much time, he said. They're watching. My blood ran cold. Who? He exhaled sharply. You really have no idea what you've stepped into, do you? I clenched my fists. I just want my father back. The man tapped the device, and the screen changed. A new video feed appeared, this time showing a dimly lit corridor with a steel door at the end. A timestamp in the corner indicated it was live footage. He's here, the man said. For now. A knot formed in my stomach. What do you mean for now? The masked man hesitated, then finally said he was taken for a reason. And if you want to get him back, you need to understand why. I gritted my teeth. Then start talking. The man leaned forward. Your father wasn't just a businessman. He was part of something bigger than you realize. And the people who took him, they don't take prisoners without purpose. I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. He was just a normal guy. A dark chuckle escaped the man's lips. No, he wasn't. He pointed at the screen. And if you don't act fast, you'll never get the chance to hear the truth from him yourself. My breath quickened. What do I have to do? The man pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and slid it across the table. This is your way in. A time, a place, and a name. Memorize it, then burn it. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly as I read the contents. The name meant nothing to me, but the address, it was somewhere downtown, in an area I knew wasn't exactly friendly to outsiders. The man stood up. You have 24 hours. After that, they move him, and you lose your only chance. I swallowed hard. Why are you helping me? For the first time, I saw something resembling emotion in his eyes. Because I lost someone too. And I wasn't fast enough. Without another word, He turned and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, he glanced back. "Be careful. Once you step into this world, there's no going back." Then he was gone. I sat there, staring at the flickering screen, my father's face frozen in time. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew one thing for certain. I was running out of time. I sat in my dimly lit apartment, staring at the crumpled paper in my hands. The name, the address, the time, it was all burned into my memory. I had less than 24 hours to figure out my next move, but the reality was setting in fast. I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't a fighter, a hacker, or some covert agent. I was just a desperate son trying to save his father from something far bigger than me. But I had come too far to turn back now. I spread out everything I had on the table, my laptop, a map of the city, and a burner phone I had picked up earlier. I scoured the address through every dark web form and hidden database I had access to. The location wasn't just dangerous, it was a fortress. A repurposed warehouse, surrounded by security, cameras, and God knows what else. It wasn't a place where people walked in and out freely. This wasn't just some underground trade, it was an operation. And I was about to walk right into it. I needed a plan. The first step was reconnaissance. That night, I drove past the location, keeping my distance, observing from the shadows. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A guard stood at the entrance, another patrolling the perimeter. Darkened windows gave no indication of what was inside. I couldn't get a clear count of how many people were in there, but it was enough to make me realize one thing. I wasn't getting in through the front door. I circled the block, looking for weaknesses. Then I found it, a service entrance on the back, padlocked, no cameras in sight. It wasn't much, but it was something. I pulled out my burner phone and dialed the only person I knew might be able to help. "Eli." A groggy voice answered. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "I don't have time for that," I said. "I need your help." A pause. Then, "This about your dad?" "Yes." Another silence. Then a sigh. "Where do we start?" Eli was an old friend, one of the few people I trusted. He had a history with systems, security, hacking, anything digital. If anyone could give me an edge, it was him. We met an hour later at a diner on the outskirts of town. I laid out everything I had, and he listened, his expression darkening with every detail. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're talking about infiltrating a human trafficking ring like it's a high school prank." "I don't have a choice." He rubbed his face. "What's the plan?" I took a deep breath. I get in through the service entrance. Once inside, I locate my dad, disable security if possible, and we get out. Eli gave me a look that screamed, "You're an idiot. You'll never make it out alive. Which is why I need your help." He sighed, shaking his head. "You realize even if I loop the cameras or disable alarms, that doesn't stop actual people from shooting you, right?" I clenched my fists. "I'll handle that part." Eli studied me for a long moment, then exhaled heavily. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" I nodded. "With or without you." He cursed under his breath, then slid his laptop out of his bag. "Fine. But if we do this, we do it smart." I leaned in. "What do you have in mind?" Eli cracked his knuckles, pulling up schematics of the area. "Let's break into hell." Midnight loomed, and the warehouse stood before me like a sleeping beast, its darkened structure a silent warning of the danger within. I adjusted the earpiece Eli had given me, my only real lifeline in this operation. His voice crackled through the line, steady but tinged with concern. "All right, you're at the perimeter. Security patterns are mostly consistent. The patrol will loop back in 2 minutes. That's your window." I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no turning back now. I darted across the lot, sticking to the shadows. My gloved hands found the padlock on the service entrance, the weak point I had scouted earlier. Eli had warned me about trip alarms, so I moved carefully, pulling out a small device he had given me. I attached it to the lock, holding my breath as it worked its magic. A soft click, and the shackle sprang free. "I'm in," I whispered. "Good. Now get moving. You have approximately 7 minutes before the next internal security sweep." Inside, the warehouse was eerily silent, the air thick with oil and dust. Stacks of crates lined the walls, each one unmarked and ominous. A single overhead bulb flickered, casting warped shadows across the floor. I crouched low, making my way toward the central corridor where Eli said the main holding area should be. "Camera in the next hallway," Eli warned. "Give me a second, and there. Looping it now. Move." I slipped past, pressing against the cold metal wall. My father had to be here. He had to be. Then I heard it, muffled voices up ahead. I inched closer, peering through a small gap between the crates. 2 guards stood outside a reinforced door, rifles slung over their shoulders. My stomach twisted. I wasn't equipped for a fight, and sneaking past them would be nearly impossible in such a tight space. I whispered into my mic, "Eli, I need a distraction." A pause. Then, on it. Moments later, a loud crash echoed from the opposite end of the warehouse. The guard snapped to attention, exchanging quick words before one of them moved toward the noise, rifle raised. The second remained by the door, shifting uneasily. I couldn't afford hesitation. I crept forward, silent as death, until I was within reach. My fingers wrapped around the hilt of the small knife I had tucked into my belt. One strike, clean and fast. Just like I had practiced. Before the guard could react, I clamped a hand over his mouth and drove the blade into his side. A muffled grunt, a twitch, and then he went limp. I barely had time to steady my breath before I heard a voice from my earpiece. "Urgent. Company's coming. Move." I scrambled for the door, fishing the stolen keycard from the guard's belt. The reader blinked red, then green. The lock disengaged with a soft hiss, and I pushed inside. And there he was. Bound to a chair, barely conscious, his face hollow and bruised, but alive. "Dad," I choked out. His eyes flickered open, hazy but aware. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he uttered the words that sent ice through my veins. "You shouldn't have come." My father's voice was barely a whisper, but his words struck like a hammer to my chest. "You shouldn't have come." I rushed forward, my hands fumbling with the ropes that bound him to the chair. Up close, he looked even worse than I had thought. His face was gaunt, his wrists raw from the restraints. His breath was shallow, but his eyes were sharp, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Not fear. Not relief. Resignation. "I'm getting you out of here," I said, my voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "No," he croaked, shaking his head. "You don't understand." I ignored him, cutting through the last of the ropes. He slumped forward, and I caught him, my heart pounding. "Eli, I have him," I whispered into my earpiece. "What's my exit?" Eli's voice crackled through. "Not good. They know something's up. You've got guards moving in. Closest way out is through the maintenance corridor to your left." I hoisted my father up, throwing his arm over my shoulder. He groaned but didn't resist. I half-dragged, half-carried him toward the door, my mind racing. We stepped into the corridor just as a shadow moved ahead. A guard. I barely had time to react before he turned, eyes widening at the sight of us. "Hey." I lunged before he could finish, slamming into him with all my weight. We crashed into the wall, and I drove my elbow into his throat. He gagged, clawing at me, but I grabbed his rifle and swung it hard against his temple. He crumpled to the ground. My father coughed behind me, his breath ragged. "This is bigger than you know," he muttered. "Later," I hissed. "We have to move." I pulled him along, my heart hammering. Every second we wasted brought more danger. We reached the maintenance door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. Locked. "Eli, I whispered, panic creeping in. Doors locked. Give me a second, working on it. We didn't have a second. Footsteps thundered down the hall. I spun around just as 2 more guards appeared, weapons raised. Get down. I shoved my father behind me as the first shot rang out. I threw myself against the wall, yanking the rifle up. My shoulder screamed in protest, but I squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked against me, and the closest guard staggered back, blood blooming across his chest. The second one dove for cover, returning fire. Bullets whizzed past, chipping at the concrete. Eli. Almost there. I fired again, forcing the guard back. My father was slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. We couldn't hold out much longer. Then the maintenance door buzzed and clicked open. Go! Eli shouted. I grabbed my father and bolted through, slamming the door shut behind us. We were in a narrow tunnel, the air damp and stale. My father gasped for breath, gripping my arm. You don't get it, he panted. They won't stop. Not now. Not ever. I turned to him, my pulse still racing. Then tell me, Dad, what the hell is going on? He looked at me then, really looked at me. And what he said next changed everything. They didn't take me. He swallowed hard. I went willingly. I stared at my father, my mind struggling to process his words. You went willingly? My voice barely rose above a whisper, yet the accusation in it was clear. He nodded, his face etched with exhaustion and something deeper, guilt. I had no choice. Anger flared inside me, mixing with the lingering fear. No choice? They tortured you. They locked you up like an animal. He sighed, looking away. You don't understand, son. If I hadn't gone, if I hadn't agreed to their terms, they would have come for you instead. The weight of his words pressed down on my chest. Who are they? I demanded. What do they want? My father hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the end of the tunnel where we had just escaped. They call themselves the Order. The Order? The name sent a chill through me, though it meant nothing, yet. They operate in the shadows, controlling things that should never be controlled. They don't just take people, they erase them, rewrite them. And once you're in, there's no getting out. I clenched my fists. But you got out. He shook his head. No. They let me leave. Because they knew I'd lead them to you. My breath caught. What? His hands trembled as he gripped my arm. They've been watching you, Alex. Ever since I disappeared, they knew you'd come looking. They counted on it. I felt cold, my pulse pounding in my ears. Why? What do they want with me? His eyes darkened. Because you're the only one who can expose them. I took a step back, shaking my head. That doesn't make sense. He exhaled sharply. It will. But first, we have to keep moving. Eli's voice crackled in my earpiece. Guys, we have a problem. They're onto us. I turned toward my father. Is there another way out? He hesitated before nodding. There's an abandoned rail line beneath this tunnel. It leads outside the city limits. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. My mind swirled with questions, doubts, but one thing was clear, the Order wasn't finished with us yet. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered the truth. The abandoned rail line stretched before us like a dark vein, leading into the unknown. The walls of the tunnel dripped with moisture, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. My father moved slowly, his injuries taking their toll, but he pressed forward with quiet determination. I followed, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Eli's voice crackled in my earpiece. Alex, I've intercepted their communications. They're closing in, fast. I clenched my jaw. How many? Too many, Eli replied grimly. You have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the tunnel entrance. My father stopped and turned toward me. We have to pick up the pace. I nodded, adjusting my grip under his arm. Come on. We moved deeper into the tunnel, our footsteps echoing against the damp walls. The darkness pressed in, swallowing what little light seeped through the cracks in the old infrastructure. I fought against the gnawing fear clawing at the edges of my mind. What do they want from me? I asked, keeping my voice low. My father hesitated before answering. The order doesn't just erase people, Alex. They remake them. They use information, secrets, and technology that the world isn't ready to understand. He paused, his breathing ragged. And you hold a key to something they need. I frowned. What key? I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, it's important enough for them to send an entire strike team after you. The realization sent a cold chill through me. I had been so focused on finding my father that I hadn't stopped to question why the order had allowed me to get this far. Maybe I wasn't just a loose end, they wanted something from me, and they were willing to tear apart the city to get it. A distant noise broke through my thoughts. Footsteps. Multiple sets. They're here, I whispered. My father's grip on my arm tightened. We have to run. Adrenaline surged through me as we broke into a sprint. The tunnel walls blurred as we raced forward, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind us. A sharp burst of light from behind illuminated the darkness, flashlights. They were close. Too close. Eli's voice came through my earpiece. There's an emergency exit about 200 yards ahead. I'm unlocking it now. Got it, I muttered, pushing forward with renewed urgency. The tunnel seemed endless, but then, up ahead, I saw it, a rusted metal door built into the tunnel wall. My father staggered, his strength failing, and I practically dragged him the last few feet. My hands fumbled with the latch, my breath coming in short gasps. A bullet ricocheted off the wall beside me. I flinched but kept working. Come on, I muttered. Then, with a groan of metal, the door swung open. I shoved my father through and followed, slamming it shut behind us. The lock clicked into place just as fists pounded against the metal. We stood there, breathless, in absolute darkness. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Eli's voice crackled back in. You're not safe yet. Keep moving. I exhaled shakily and reached for my father's hand. Let's go. The chase wasn't over. Not yet. The air inside the narrow corridor was stale, thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. The pounding on the door behind us hadn't stopped. The order's agents were relentless, their voices muffled but urgent as they tried to break through. My father leaned against the wall, clutching his side, his breathing shallow. I had no idea how much longer he could keep going. Eli's voice crackled in my earpiece. You bought yourselves a few minutes, but that door won't hold forever. You need to move. Now. I scanned our surroundings. The emergency exit had led us into what looked like an abandoned maintenance shaft. Pipes ran along the walls, dripping water into shallow puddles on the ground. A dim light flickered somewhere in the distance, our only indication of where to go. Can you walk? I asked my father, gripping his arm. He nodded weakly. I'll manage. I didn't believe him, but there was no time to argue. I threw his arm over my shoulder and started moving, our footsteps splashing softly against the damp floor. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the door to burst open at any moment. Eli's voice returned. The tunnel you're in connects to an old service station beneath the city. If you can make it there, I can get you topside. Got it. How far? About 100 yards. But there's a problem. Of course there was. What kind of problem? The order's not just chasing you. They're trying to cut you off. I'm picking up movement in the station ahead. I swore under my breath. We were running out of options. Any other exits? Not from where you are. You'll have to fight your way through. My grip on the gun tightened. I had barely used it, but now it felt like a lifeline. How many? At least 3, Eli replied. Armed. They're covering the main corridor, which means they know you're coming. I exhaled slowly. We had no element of surprise, no advantage except desperation. We have to keep going, I told my father. Can you handle this? His gaze hardened. I don't have a choice. We pressed forward, each step bringing us closer to whatever waited ahead. The flickering light grew steadier as we neared the station. I could make out the faint outline of an old platform, rusted and crumbling with age. And just beyond it, movement. I dropped into a crouch, pulling my father down with me. 3 figures stood near the exit, their rifles held loosely but ready. They weren't in a hurry. They thought they had us cornered. Eli whispered in my ear, "You need a distraction." I glanced around, spotting a loose pipe near the ceiling. If I could dislodge it, the noise might give us an opening. I motioned for my father to stay put, then picked up a chunk of concrete from the ground. With a quick toss, I sent it crashing into the pipe. The clatter echoed through the tunnel. The guard snapped to attention, turning toward the sound. It was all the opening we needed. I raised my gun and fired. The first shot struck the nearest guard in the shoulder. He stumbled, crying out in pain. The second turned, raising his rifle, but my father was faster. He fired twice, his aim steady despite his injuries. The third tried to run for cover, but I put him down with a shot to the leg. He collapsed, his rifle skidding across the ground. Silence fell. My heart hammered in my chest, the reality of what we had done sinking in. But there was no time to dwell on it. "Go," Eli urged. "You need to get out of there now." I helped my father to his feet, and we stumbled toward the exit. The city awaited above, but the order wouldn't stop. This wasn't over. Not yet.